Good evening, everyone. My name is Robert Tobias. To my right is Will Byrne. To my left is Mike Breen. And today we have a wonderful selection for you. The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. This is one of those classic little stories that's just spooky enough to get us into the season without us having to worry about the justification of having to do something different in October. Don't worry, we've got something fun planned. But without any further ado, I'll begin. Chapter 1. The Strange Man's Arrival. The stranger came early in February, one wintry day. Though a biting wind and a driving snow, the last snowfall of the year, over the town, walking as it seemed from Bramblehurst railway station, carrying a little black portmanteau in his thickly gloved hand. He was wrapped from head to foot, and the brim of his soft felt hat had every inch of his face, but the shiny tip of his nose. The snow had piled itself against his shoulders and chest, and adding a white crest to the burden he carried. He staggered into the coach and horses, more dead than alive, it seemed, and flung his portmanteau down. "A fire!" he cried. "In the name of human charity, a room and a fire!" He stamped and shook the snow from off himself in the bar, and followed Mrs. Hall in her guest parlor to strike his bargain. And with that much introduction, and that ready acquaintance, terms, a couple of sovereigns flung upon the table, he took up his quarters in the inn. Mrs. Hall lit the fire and left him there while she set to prepare him a meal with her own hands. A guest to stop in Imping in the winter-time was an unheard-of piece of luck, let alone a guest who was no haggler, and she was resolved to show herself worthy of her good fortune. As soon as the bacon was well under way, and Milly, the lymphatic aid, had been brushed up a bit by a few deftly chosen expressions of contempt, she carried the cloth, plates, and glasses into the parlor and began to lay them with the utmost éclat. Although the fire was burning up briskly, she was surprised to see that her visitor still wore his hat and coat, standing with his back to her and staring out the window at the falling snow in the yard. His gloved hands were clasped behind him. He seemed to be lost in thought. She noticed that the melted snow that sprinkled his shoulders, dropping upon her carpet. "Can I take your hat and coat, sir?" she said, "and give them a good drying in the kitchen?" "No," he said without turning. She was not quite sure she heard him, and was about to repeat her question. He turned his head, looked at her over his shoulder. "I prefer to keep them on," he said with emphasis, and she noticed that he wore big blue spectacles with sidelights, and he had a bushy side whisker over his coat collar that completely hid his cheeks and face. "Very well, sir," she said. "As you like it, in a bit the room will be warmer." He made no answer, and he turned to face away from her again. And Mrs. Hall, feeling that her conversational advances were ill-timed, laid the rest of the table things in a quick staccato and whisked out the room. She returned. He was still there, like a man of stone, his back hunched, his collar upturned, his dripping hat brim turned down, hiding his face and his ears completely. She put down the eggs and bacon with considerable emphasis, and called rather than said to him, "Your lunch is served, sir." "Thank you," he said at the same time, and he did not stir until she was closing the door. Then he swung around and approached the table with a certain eager quickness. As she went behind the bar to the kitchen, she heard a sound repeated at regular intervals. Chirk, chirk, chirk it went, the sound of a spoon being scraped and whisked around a basin. "That girl," she said. "There, I clean forgot it. It's her being so long." And while she herself finished mixing the mustard, she gave Milly a few verbal stabs for her excessive slowness. She had cooked the ham, the eggs, laid the table, and done everything, while Milly, help indeed, had only succeeded in delaying the mustard, and him, a new guest, and wanting to stay. Then she filled the mustard pot and, putting it with a certain staleness upon a gold and black tea tray, carried it into the parlor. She rapped and entered promptly. As she did so, her visitor moved quickly so that she got but a glimpse of a white object disappearing behind the table. It would seem he was picking up something from the floor. She rapped the mustard pot on the table. Then she noticed the overcoat and the hat had been taken off over the chair in front of the fire, and a pair of wet boots threatened to rust her steel fender. She went to these things resolutely. "I suppose I may have to dry them now," she said, the voice that brooked no denial. "Leave the hat," her visitor said, in a muffled voice, and turning she saw he raised his head, and he was sitting and looking at her. For a moment she stood gaping at him, too surprised to speak. He held a white cloth, it was a serviette he had brought with him, over the lower part of his face, so that his mouth and jaw were completely hidden. That was the reason his muffled voice was so. But it was not that which startled Mrs. Hall. It was the fact that all his forehead, above the blue glasses, was covered by a white bandage, and another covering his ears, leaving not a scrap of face exposed except only just his pink nose. It was a bright pink and shiny, just as it had been at first. He wore a dark brown velvet jacket with a high black linen-lined collar turned up about his neck. The thick black hair, escaping as it could from below the crossing of bandages, projected in curious tails and horns, giving him the strangest appearance conceivable. This muffled and bandaged head was so unlike what she had anticipated. For a moment she was rigid. He did not remove the serviette, but he remained holding it, as she saw now, with a brown-gloved hand, and regarding her with inscrutable blue glasses. "Leave the hat," he said, speaking distinctly through the white cloth. Her nerves began to recover from the shock they had received. She placed the hat on a chair and by the fire. "I didn't know, sir, that—" She stopped, embarrassed. "Thank you," he said dryly, glancing from her to the door and at her again. "I'll have him nice and dry, sir, at once," she said, and carried his clothes out of the room. She glanced at the white swathed head and the blue goggles again as she was going out the door, but his napkin was still in front of his face. She shivered a little as she closed the door behind her, and her face was eloquent for surprise and perplexity. "I never," she whispered. "There!" She went, bless you,
Thank you.
quite softly to the kitchen, and was too preoccupied to ask Milly what she was messing about with now when she got there. The visitor sat and listened to her retreating feet. He glanced inquiringly at the window before he removed his serviette and resumed his meal. He took a mouthful, glanced suspiciously at the window, and took another mouthful, then rose again, taking the serviette in hand, and walked across the room, pulled the blinds down on top of the white muslin, and obscured the lower panels. This left the room in twilight. This done, he returned to an easier air to the table and his meal. "The poor soul's had an incidental operation or something," said Mrs. Hall. "What a turn them bandages to give me, to be sure." She put on some more coal, unfolded the cloth horse, and extended the traveler's coat upon it. "And they goggles! Why, he looked more like a diving helmet than a human being." She hung his muffler in the corner of the horse. "And holding that handkerchief over his mouth all the time, talking through it? Perhaps his mouth was hurt too, maybe." She turned around, as one who suddenly remembers. "Bless my soul alive," she said, looking on a tangent. "Ain't you done with them taters yet, Milly?" When Mrs. Hall went to clear away the stranger's lunch, her idea that his mouth must have been cut or disfigured in the accidents she supposed him to have and suffered was confirmed, for he was smoking a pipe, and all the time she was in the room he never loosened the silk muffler he had wrapped around the lower part of his face to put the mouthpiece to his lips. Yet it was not forgetfulness, for she saw he glanced at it as it smoldered out. He sat in the corner with his back to the window blind, and now spoke, having eaten and drunk and been comfortably warmed through, with less aggressive bravado than before. The reflection of the fire lent a kind of red animation to his big spectacles they had lacked hitherto. "I have some luggage," she said, "at Bramblehurst Station," and he asked her how he could get it sent. He bowed his bandaged head quite politely, acknowledging of her explanation. "Tomorrow," he said. "There's no speedier delivery?" And seemed quite disappointed when she answered. No. Was she quite sure no man with a trap would have gone over? Mrs. Hall, nothing loath, answered his question and developed a conversation. "It's a steep road by the down, sir," she said in answering the question about the trap, and then, snatching an opening, said, "It was there a carriage was sent up a year ago and more. A gentleman killed by the coachman accidentally, sir. Happen in a moment, don't they?" But the visitor was not drawn so easily. "They do," he said through a muffler, eyeing her quietly through his impenetrable glasses. "But they take it long enough to get well, sir, don't they? And my sister's son, Tom, just cut his arm with a sickle, tumbled on it in hayfield, and bless me, he was 3 months tied up. You'd hardly believe it. It's regular giving me dread of a sight, sir." "I can quite understand that," said the visitor. "He was afraid one time that he'd have an operation. He was that bad, sir." The visitor laughed abruptly and barked a laugh that he seemed to bite and kill with his mouth. "Was he?" he said. "He was, sir, and no laughing matter to them as had doing for him, as I had. My sister being took up with her little one so much, there was a bandage to do, sir, and bandages to undo. So if I may be so bold as to say it, sir." "Will you give me some matches?" said the visitor, quite abruptly. "My pipe is out." Mrs. Hall was pulled up silently. It was certainly rude of him, after telling him all she had done. She gasped at him for a moment, and remembered 2 sovereigns. She went for the matches. "Thanks," he said concisely, and she put them down, and turned his shoulder upon her, staring out of the window again. It was altogether too discouraging. Evidently he was sensitive on the topic of the operations and bandages. She did not make so bold to say, however, after all. Perhaps his snubbing way had irritated her, and Milly had a hot time with that afternoon. The visitor remained in the parlor until 4 o'clock, without giving the ghost of an excuse for an intrusion. For the most part he was quite still during the time. It would seem that he sat in the growing darkness, smoking in the firelight, perhaps dozing. Once or twice a curious listener might have heard him at the coals. For a space of 5 minutes he was audibly pacing the room. He seemed to be talking to himself. Then the armchair creaked as he sat down again.
Chapter 2. Mr. Teddy Henfrey's First Impressions. At 4 o'clock, when it was fairly dark and Mrs. Hall was screwing up her courage to go in and ask her visitor if he would take some tea, Teddy Henfrey, the clock jobber, came into the bar. "My sakes, Mrs. Hall," said he, "but this is terrible weather for thin boots." The snow outside was falling faster. Mrs. Hall agreed with him, and then noticed he had his bag, and hit upon a brilliant idea. "Now you're going in here, Mr. Teddy," said she. "I'd be glad if you'd give the old clock in the parlour a bit of a look. She's going, and it strikes well and hearty, but the hour hand won't do nothing but stick point at 6. And leading the way, she went across to the parlour door and rapped and entered. Her visitor, she saw as she opened the door, was seated in the armchair before the fire, dozing, it would seem, with his bandaged head drooping on one side. The only light in the room was the red glow from the fire, which lit his eyes like adverse railway signals, but left his downcast face in darkness, and the scanty vestiges of the day that came in through the open door. Everything was ruddy, shadowy, and indistinct to her, the more so since she had just been lighting the bar lamp, and her eyes were frazzled. But for a moment it seemed to her that the man she looked at had an enormous mouth wide open, a vast and incredible mouth that swallowed the whole of the lower portion of his face. It was the sensation of a moment, the white-bound head, the monstrous goggle eyes, and his huge yawn below it. Then he stirred, started up in his chair, put up his hand. She opened the door wide so that the room was lighter, and she saw him more clearly, with the muffler held to his face just as she had seen him hold the serviette before. The shadows, she fancied, had tricked her. "Would you mind, sir, this man coming to look at the clock, sir?" she said, recovering from her momentary shock. "Look at the clock," he said, staring round in a drowsy manner and speaking over his hand, and then getting more fully awake. "Certainly." Mrs. Hall went to get a lamp, and he rose and stretched himself. Then came the light, and Mr. Teddy Hinfrey, entering, was confronted by this bandaged person. He was, he says, tight in the back. "Good afternoon," said the stranger, regarding him, as Mr. Hinfrey says, with a vivid sense of the dark spectacles, like a lobster. "I hope," said Mr. Hinfrey, "that is no intrusion." "None whatsoever," said the stranger, "though I understand," he said, turning to Mrs. Hall, "that this room is really to be mine for my own private use." "I thought, sir," said Mrs. Hall, "you prefer the clock." She was going to say mended. "Certainly," said the stranger, "certainly. But as a rule, I like to be alone and undisturbed." "But I'm really glad to have the clock seen to," he said, with a certain hesitation in Mr. Hinfrey's manner. "Very glad." Mr. Hinfrey had intended to apologize and withdraw, but this anticipation reassured him. The stranger stood round with his back to the fireplace and put his hands behind his back. "And presently," he said, "when the clock mending is over, I think I should like to have some tea, but not till the clock mending is over." Mrs. Hall was about to leave the room. She made no conversational advances this time because she did not want to be snubbed in front of Mr. Hinfrey, when her visitor asked her if she had made any arrangements about his boxes at Bramblehurst. She told him she had mentioned the matter to the postman, and that the carrier could bring them over on the morrow. "You are certain that is the earliest?" he said. She was certain, with a marked coldness. "I should explain," he added, "what I really was too cold and fatigued to do before, that I am an experimental investigator." "Indeed, sir," said Mrs. Hall, much impressed. "And my baggage contains apparatus and appliances." "Very useful things indeed they are, sir," said Mrs. Hall. "And I'm naturally anxious to get on with my inquiries." "Of course, sir. My reason for coming to Epping," he proceeded, with a certain deliberation of manner, "was a desire for solitude. I do not wish to be disturbed in my work. In addition to my work, an accident, or I thought as much," said Mrs. Hall to herself, "necessitates a certain retirement. My eyes are sometimes too weak and painful that I have to shut myself up in the dark for hours altogether. Lock myself up, sometimes, now and then. Not at present, certainly. But at such times, the slightest disturbance, the entry of a stranger into the room, is a source of excruciating annoyance to me. It is well these things should be understood." "Oh, certainly, sir," said Mrs. Hall. "And if I might make so bold as to ask—" "That, I think, is all," said the stranger, with that quietly irresistible air of finality he could assume at will. Mrs. Hall reserved her question and sympathy for a better occasion. After Mrs. Hall had left the room, he remained standing in front of the fire, glaring, so Mr. Hinfrey puts it, at the clock mending. Mr. Hinfrey not only took the hands off the clock and the face, but extracted the works, and he tried to work in as slow and quiet and unassuming a manner as possible. He worked with the lamp close to him, and the green shade threw a brilliant light upon his hands and upon the frame and wheels, and left the rest of the room shadowy. When he looked up, coloured patches swam in his eyes. Being constitutionally of a curious nature, he had removed the works, a quite unnecessary proceeding, with the idea of delaying his departure and perhaps falling into conversation with the stranger. But the stranger stood there, perfectly silent and still, so still it got on Hinfrey's nerves. He felt alone in the room and looked up, and there, grey and dim, with a bandaged head and huge blue lenses staring fixedly, with a mist of green spots drifting in front of him. It was so uncanny looking to Hinfrey that for a moment they remained staring blankly at one another. Then Hinfrey looked down again. Very uncomfortable position. One would like to say something. Should he remark that the weather was very cold for that time of year? He looked up as if to take aim with that introductory shot. "The weather," he began. "Why don't you finish and go?" said the rigid figure, evidently in a state of painfully suppressed rage. "All you've got to do is fix the hour hand on its axle. You're simply humbugging." "Certainly, sir. 1 minute more, sir. I overlooked—" And Mr. Hinfrey finished and went. but he went off feeling excessively annoyed. "Damn it," said Mr. Henfrey to himself, trudging down the village through the thawing snow. "A man must do a clock at times, shouldn't I?" And again, "Can't a man look at you? Ugly!" And yet again, "Seemingly not. If the police were wanting you, you couldn't be more rocked and bandaged." At Gleason's Corner he saw Hall, who had recently married the stranger's hostess at the Coach and Horses, and now drove the Ipping conveyance, where occasional people required it, to Sidderbridge Junction, coming towards him on his return from that place. Hall had evidently been stopping a bit at Sidderbridge, to judge by his driving. "How do, Teddy?" he said, passing by. "You got a wrong one up home," said Teddy. Hall very sociably pulled up. "What's that?" he said. "Rum-looking customer stopping at the Coach and Horses," said Teddy. "My sakes!" And he proceeded to give Hall a vivid description of his grotesque guest. "Looks a bit like a disguise, don't it? I'd like to see a man's face if I had him stopping in my place," said Henry. "But women are that trustful where strangers are concerned. He's took your rooms and he ain't even given a name or." "You don't say so," said Hall, who was a man of sluggish apprehension. "Yes," said Teddy, "by the week. Whatever he is, you can't get rid of him under the week. And he's got a lot of luggage coming in tomorrow, so he says. Let's hope it won't be stones in boxes all." He told Hall how his aunt at Hastings had been swindled by a stranger with empty portmanteau. Altogether he left Hall vaguely suspicious. "Get up, old girl," said Hall. "I suppose I must see about this." Teddy trudged on his way with his mind considerably relieved. But instead of seeing about it, however, Hall on his return was severely rated by his wife on the length of time he spent in Sidderbridge, and his mild inquiries were answered snappishly and in a manner not to the point. But the seed of suspicion Teddy had sown germinated in the mind of Mr. Hall in spite of these discouragements. "You women don't know everything," said Mr. Hall, resolved to ascertain more about the personality of his guest at the earliest possible opportunity. And after the stranger had gone to bed, which he did about 9:30, Mr. Hall went very aggressively into the parlour and looked very hard at his wife's furniture, just to show that the stranger wasn't master there, and scrutinized closely and a little contemptuously a sheet of mathematical computation the stranger had left. When retiring for the evening, he instructed Mrs. Hall to look very closely at the stranger's luggage when it came the next day. "You mind your business, Hall," said Mrs. Hall, "and I'll mind mine." She was all the more inclined to snap at Hall because the stranger was undoubtedly an unusual, strange sort of stranger, and she was by no means assured about him in her right mind. In the middle of the night, she woke up dreaming of huge white heads like turnips that came trailing after her at the end of interminable necks and with vast black eyes. But, being a sensible woman, she subdued her terrors and turned over and went to sleep again.
Chapter 3. The 1001 Bottles. So it was that on the 29th day of February, at the beginning of the thaw, this singular person fell out of infinity into Ipping village. Next day his luggage arrived through the slush, and very remarkable luggage it was. There were a couple of trunks indeed, such as a rational man might need, but in addition there were a box of books, big, fat books, of which some were just an incomprehensible handwriting, and a dozen or more crates, boxes, and cases containing objects packed in straw, as it seemed to Hall, tugging with casual curiosity at the straw, glass bottles. The stranger, muffled in hat, coat, gloves, and wrapper, came out impatiently to meet Fairnside's cart, while Hall was having a word or so of gossip preparatory to helping bring them in. Out he came, not noticing Fairnside's dog, who was sniffing the Deliante spirit at Hall's legs. "Come along with those boxes," he said. "I've been waiting long enough." And he came down the steps towards the tail of the cart, as if to lay hands on the smaller crate. No sooner had Fairnside's dog caught sight of him, however, than it began to bristle and growl savagely. And when he rushed towards the steps, it gave an undecided hop and then sprang straight at his hand. "Whoop!" cried Hall, jumping back, for he was no hero with dogs, and Fahrenheit howled, "Lie down!" and snatched his whip. They saw the dog's teeth had slipped the hand hard, and heard a kick, and saw the dog execute a flanking jump and get home to the stranger's leg, and heard the rip of his trousering. When the finer end of Fahrenheit's whip reached his property, and the dog, yelping with dismay, retreated under the wheels of the wagon, it was all the business of a swift half-minute. No one spoke. Everyone shouted. The stranger glanced swiftly at his torn glove and at his leg, made as if he would stoop to the ladder, and turned and rushing swiftly up to the steps of the inn. They heard him go headlong across the passage and up to the uncarpeted stairs to his bedroom. "You brute, you," said Fahrenheit, climbing off the wagon with his whip in his hand while the dog watched him through the wagon wheels. "Come here," said Fahrenheit, "you better." Hall had stood gaping. "He was bit," said Hall. "I'd better go see to him." And he trotted after the stranger. He met Mrs. Hall in the passage. "Carry his dog," he said. "Bit him." He went straight upstairs, and the stranger's door being ajar, he pushed it open and was entering without any ceremony, being of a naturally sympathetic turn of mind. The blind was down and the room was dim. He caught a glimpse of a most singular thing, what seemed a handless arm waving toward him, and a face of 3 huge, indeterminate spots on white, very like the face of a pale pansy. Then he was struck violently in the chest, hurled back, and the door slammed in his face and locked. It was so rapid it gave him no time to observe. A waving of indecipherable shapes, a blow, and a concussion. There he stood in the dark little landing, wondering what it might be that he had seen. A couple minutes after, he joined the little group that had formed outside the coach and horses. There was Fahrenheit telling about it all over again for the second time, and there was Mrs. Hall saying the dog didn't have no business to bite her guests, and there was Huckster, the general dealer from over the road, interrogative, and Sandy Rogers from the forge, judicial. Besides women and children, all of them saying fatuities. "Wouldn't let him bite me, I knows. 'Twasn't right to have such dogs. What'd bite him for then?" And so forth. Mr. Hall, staring at them from the steps and listening, found it incredible that he had seen anything so very remarkable happen upstairs. Besides, his vocabulary was altogether too limited to express his impressions. "He didn't want no help, he says," he said in answer to his wife's inquiry. "We better be taking in his luggage." "He ought to have it cauterized at once," said Mr. Huckster, "especially if it's all inflamed." "I'd shoot him, that's what I'd do," said a lady of the group, and suddenly the dog began growling again. "Come along," cried an angry voice in the doorway, and there stood the muffled stranger, with his collar turned up and his hat brim bent down. "The sooner you get those things in, the better, I'll be pleased," he stated by an anonymous bystander, and his trousers and gloves had been changed. "Was you hurt, sir?" said Fahrenheit. "I'm rare sorry about that dog." "Not a bit," said the stranger. "Never broke my skin. Hurry up and get those things." He then swore to himself, so Mr. Hall asserts. Directly the first crate was, in accordance with his directions, carried into the parlor, and the stranger flung himself upon it with extraordinary eagerness and began to unpack it, scattering the straw with an utter disregard for Mr. Hall's carpet, and from it he began to produce bottles, little fat bottles containing powders, small and slender bottles containing colored and white fluids, fluted blue bottles labeled poison, bottles with round bodies and slender necks, large green glass bottles, large white glass bottles, bottles with glass stoppers and frosted labels, bottles with fine corks, bottles with bungs, bottles with wooden caps, wine bottles, salad oil bottles, putting them in rows on the chiffonier, on the mantel, on the table, under the window, around the floor, on the bookshelf, everywhere. The chemist's shop in Bramblehurst could not boast half so many. Quite a sight it was. Crate after crate yielded bottles until all 6 were empty and the table high with straw. The only things that came out of these crates beside the bottles were a number of test tubes and a carefully packed balance. And directly the crates were unpacked, the stranger went to the window and set to work, not troubling in the least about the litter of straw, the fire of which had gone out, and the boxes of books outside, nor the trunks and other luggage that had gone upstairs. When Mrs. Hall took his dinner to him, he was already so absorbed in his work, pouring little drops out of bottles into test tubes, that he did not hear her until she had swept away the bulk of the straw and put the tray onto the table, with some little emphasis, perhaps, seeing the state that the floor was in. Then he half turned his head and immediately turned it away again. But she saw he had removed his glasses. They were beside him on the table, and it seemed to her that his eye sockets were extraordinarily hollow. He put on his spectacles again and turned and faced her. She was about to complain of the straw on the floor when he anticipated her. "I wish you wouldn't have come without knocking," he said in the tone of an abnormal exasperation that seemed so characteristic of him. "I knocked, but seemingly, perhaps you did. But in my investigations, my very urgent, necessary investigations, the slightest disturbance, the jar of a door, I must ask you." "Certainly, sir. You can turn the lock if you'd like, that you know, any time." "A very good idea," said the stranger. "This straw, sir, if I might be so bold as to remark, don't. If the straw makes trouble, put it down in the bill." And he mumbled at her words suspiciously like curses. He was so odd standing there, and so aggressive and explosive, bottle in one hand and test tube in the other, that Mrs. Hall was quite alarmed. But she was a resolute woman. "In which case, I should like you to know, sir, that what you consider a shilling. Put down a shilling. Surely a shilling will be enough." "So be it," said Mrs. Hall, taking up the tablecloth and beginning to spread it over the table. "If you're satisfied, of course." He turned and sat down with a coat collar toward her. All the afternoon he worked with the door locked, and Mrs. Hall testifies, for the most part, in silence. But once there was a concussion and a sound of bottles ringing together as though the table had been hit, and the smash of a bottle flung violently down, and then a rapid pacing athwart the room. Fearing something was the matter, she went to the door and listened, not caring to knock. "I can't go on," he was raving. "I can't go on. 300,000, 400,000, the huge multitude, cheated! All my life it may take me. Patience, patience indeed! Fool and liar!" There was a noise of hobnails on the bricks and the bar, and Mrs. Hall had very reluctantly to leave the rest to his soliloquy. When she returned, the room was silent again, save for the faint crepitation of his chair and the occasional clink of a bottle. It was all over. The stranger had resumed work. When she took in his tea and saw broken glass in the corner of the room under the concave mirror, and a golden stain that had been carelessly wiped, she called attention to it. "Put it down on the bill," snapped the visitor. "For God's sake, don't worry me. If there's damage done, put it on the bill." And he went on ticking a list in the exercise book before him. "I'll tell you something," Fahrenheit said, mysteriously, in the late afternoon, and they were in the little beer shop of Ipping Hanger. "Well," said Teddy Henfrey, "this chap you're speaking of, that my dog bit, well, he's black. Leastways his legs are. I seed through those tears in his trousers and the tear in his glove. You'd have expected a sort of pinky to show, wouldn't you? Well, there wasn't none, just blackness. I tell you, he's black as my hat." "My sakes," said Henfrey. It's a rummy case altogether. Why, his nose is pink as a paint. That's true, said Fairnside. I knows that, and I tell you what I'm thinking. The man's a piebald, Teddy. Black here and white there in patches, and he's ashamed of it. He's a kind of half-braid, and the colours come off patchy instead of mixing. I've heard of such things before, and it's the common way with horses, as anyone can see.
Chapter 4. Mr. Cuss interviews the stranger. I have been telling the circumstances of the stranger's arrival in Ipping with a certain fullness of detail in order that curious impressions he created might be understood by the reader. But expecting two odd incidences, the circumstances of his stay until the extraordinary day of the club festival may have passed over very curiously. There were a number of skirmishes with Mrs. Hall in matters of domestic discipline, but in every case until April, when the first signs of penury began, he overrode her by the easy expedition of extra payment. Hall did not like him, and whenever he dared talked of the advisability of getting rid of him, but he showed his dislike chiefly by concealing it ostentatiously and avoiding his visitor as much as possible. "Wait till the summer," says Mrs. Hall sagely, "when the asterisks are beginning to come. Then we'll see. He may be a bit overbearing, but the bills settled punctually is bills settled punctually. Whatever you like to say." The stranger did not go to church, and indeed made no difference between Sunday and the irreligious days, even in costume. He worked, as Mrs. Hall thought, very fitfully. Some days he would come down early and be continuously busy. On others he would rise late, pacing his room, fetidly, audibly talking together, smoke, sleep in the armchair by the fire. Communication with the world beyond the village he had none. His temper continued very uncertainly, but the most part of his manner was of a man suffering under almost unendurable provocation, and once or twice things were snapped, torn, crushed, or broken in spasmodic gusts of violence. He seemed under a chronic irritation of the greatest intensity. His habit of talking to himself in a low voice grew steadily upon him, but though Mrs. Hall listened conscientiously, she could never make either heads or tails of what she heard. He went rarely abroad by daylight, but at twilight he would go out muffled by invisibility, whether the weather were cold or hot, and he chose the loneliest path and those most overshadowed by trees and banks. His goggling spectacles and ghastly bandaged face under the penthouse of his hat came with disagreeable suddenness out of darkness upon one or two home-going laborers, and Teddy Henfrey, tumbling out of the Scarlet Cove one night at 9:30, was scared shamefully by the stranger's skull-like head. He was walking hat in hand, lit by the sudden light of the open-in door. Such children as saw him at nightfall dreamt of bogies, and it seemed doubtful whether he disliked boys more than they disliked him, or the reverse. But there was certain a vivid dislike, either enough on either side. It was inevitable that a person of so remarkable an appearance and bearing should form a frequent topic in such a village as Ipping. Opinion was greatly divided about his occupation. Mrs. Hall was sensitive on the point. When questioned, she explained very carefully that he was a, quote, experimental investigator, going giddily over the syllables as one who dreads pitfalls. When asked what experimental investigator was, she would say, with a touch of superiority that most educated people knew such things as that, and would thus explain that he discovered things. Her visitor had an accident, she said, which temporarily discolored his face and hands, and being of a sensitive disposition, he was averse to any public notice of the fact. Out of her hearing, there was a very largely entertained idea that he was a criminal trying to escape from justice by wrapping himself up so as to conceal his identity altogether from the eye of the police. This idea sprang from the brain of Mr. Teddy Henfrey, No crime of any magnitude dating from the middle or end of February was known to have occurred, though. Elaborated in the imaginations of Mr. Gould, the proprietary assistant of the National School, his theory took the form that the stranger was an anarchist in disguise, preparing explosives, and he resolved to undertake such detective operations as time permitted. These consisted, for the most part, in looking very hard at the stranger whenever they met, or in asking people who had never seen the stranger leading questions about him. But he detected nothing. Another school of opinion followed Mr. Fernside, either accepted the piebald view or some modification of it, as for instance Silas Durgan, who had heard to assert, if he chose to show himself affairs he's made a fortune in no time, and being a bit of a theologian, compared the stranger to the man with the one talent. Yet another view explained the entire matter by regarding the stranger as a harmless lunatic that had the advantage of accounting for everything straight away. Between these main groups were waverers and compromisers. Sussex folks had a few superstitions, and it was only a few days after early April that the thought of the supernatural was first whispered in the village. Even then, it was only credited among the women folks. But whatever they thought of him, people at Epping, on the whole, agreed in disliking him. His irritability, though might have been comprehensible to an urban brain worker, was an amazing thing to these quiet Sussex villagers. The frantic gesticulations they surprised now and then, the headlong pace after nightfall that swept him upon them quite round and cornered, the inhuman bludgeoning of all attentive advances of curiosity, the taste for twilight that led to the choosing of him closing doors, the pulling down of blinds, the extinction of candles and lamps. Who could agree with such things going on? They drew aside as he passed down the village, and when he had gone by, young humorists would up with their coat collars and down with their hat brims, and go pacing nervously after him in imitation of his occult bearing. There was a song popular at the time called The Bogeyman. Miss Satchel sang it in the schoolroom concert in the aid of church lamps, and thereafter, whenever one or two of the villagers were gathered together and a stranger appeared, a bar or so of this tune, more or less, sharp or flat, was whistled in the midst of them. Also belated little children called Bogeyman after him and make off tremulously elated. Cuss, the general practitioner, was devoured by curiosity, though. The badges excited his professional interest. The report of 1,001 bottles aroused his jealous regard. All through April and May, he coveted an opportunity of talking to the stranger, and at last, towards Whitsuntide, he could take stand of it no longer, but hit upon the subscription list for a village nurse as an excuse. He was surprised to find that Mr. Hall did not know his guest's name. "You give a name," said Mrs. Hall, an assertion which was quite unfounded, "but I didn't want to hear it." She thought it seemed so silly not to know the man's name. Cuss rapped at the parlor door and entered. There was a fairly audible imprecation in the building. "Pardon my intrusion," said Cuss, and then the door closed and cut Mrs. Hall off for the rest of the conversation. She could hear the murmur of voices for the next 10 minutes, then a cry of surprise, a stirring of feet, a chair flung aside, a bark of laughter, quick steps to the door, and Cuss appeared, his face white, his eyes staring over his shoulder. He left the door open behind him, and without looking at her, strode across the hall and went down the stairs, as she heard the feet hurrying from the road. He carried his hat in hand and stood behind the door, looking at the open door of the parlor. Then she heard the stranger laughing quietly, and then his footsteps came across the room. She could not see his face where he stood. The parlor door slammed, and the place was silent again. Cuss went straight up to the village, to Bunting the vicar. "Am I mad?" said Cuss abruptly, as he entered the shabby little study. "Do I look like an insane person?" "What happened?" said the vicar, putting the ammonite on the loose sheets in the forthcoming sermon. "That chap at the inn. Well?" "Give me something to drink," said Cuss as he sat down. When his nerves began to be stayed by the glass of cheap sherry, the only drink the good vicar had available. He took him to the interview just as he had it. Went in, he gasped, and began to demand a subscription for the nurse fund. He stuck his hands in his pocket as I came in, and he sat down lumpily in the chair. Sniffed. I told him I've heard he has interest in scientific things. He said yes and sniffed again. Kept on sniffing all the time. Evidently, he recently caught an infernal cold. No wonder wrapped up all like that. I developed the nurse idea. After all the while, kept my eyes open. Bottles, chemicals everywhere. Balanced test tubes, stands in, and smell of evening primrose. Would he subscribe? He said he considered. Asked him point blank what he was researching. He said he was. A long research. Got quite cross. A damnable long research, he said, blowing the cork out, so to speak. Oh, said I, and out came the grievance. The man was just on the boil, with my questions boiling him over. He had been given a prescription, most valuable prescription. For what for, he wouldn't say. Was it medical? Damn you, what are you fishing after? I apologized. Dignified sniff and cough. He resumed. He read it. 5 ingredients. Put it down, turned his head. Draught of air from the window, lifted the paper. Swish, rustle. He was working in the room with an open fireplace, he said. Soft flicker, and there was a prescription burning and lifting chimneyward. Rushed towards it just as it whisked up the chimney. So, just at that point, to illustrate the story, out came his arm. Well, no hand, just an empty sleeve. Lord, I thought, that's a deformity. Got a cork arm, I suppose, and has taken it off. Then I thought, there's something odd in that. What the devil keeps that sleeve up and open? There's nothing in it. There was nothing in it, I tell you. Nothing down, not right down to the joint. I could see right down to the elbow. There was a glimmer of light shining through a tear in the cloth. Good God, I said. And then he stopped, stared at me with those blue goggles, and then at his sleeve. Well, that's all. He never said a word, just glared and put his sleeve back in his pocket. I was saying, said he, that there was prescription burning, wasn't I? Interrogative cough. How the devil can, I said, can you move an empty sleeve like that? Empty sleeve? Yes, said I, an empty sleeve. An empty sleeve, is it? You saw it was an empty sleeve. He stood up right away. I stood up too. He came toward me in 3 very slow steps. I stood quite close. Sniffed venomously. I didn't flinch, though. I'm hanged up. That bandaged knob of his, those blinkers aren't enough to unnerve anyone coming quietly up to you. You said it was an empty sleeve, he said? Certainly, I said. Then, very quietly, pulled his sleeve out his pocket again and raised his arm towards me as though he would show it to me. He did it very, very slowly. I looked at it. Seemed an age. Well, said I, clearing my throat. There's nothing in it. Had to say something. I was beginning to feel frightened. I could see right down it. He extended it straight forward towards me, slowly, slowly, just like that, until the cuff was 6 inches from my face. Queer thing to see an empty sleeve come at you like that. And then, well, something exactly like a finger or thumb, it felt, nipping at my nose. Bunting began to laugh. There wasn't anything there, said Cuss, his voice running up a shriek. We're there! It's all very well for you to laugh, but I tell you, it was so startling. I hit his cuff hard and looked around and cut out of the room. I left him. Cuss stopped. There was no mistaking the sincerity of the panic. He turned around in a helpless way, took a second glass of the excellent Vicar's very inferior sherry. When I hit his cuff, said Gus, I tell you, it felt exactly like hitting an arm. And it wasn't an arm. There wasn't the ghost of an arm. Mr. Bunting thought it over. He looked suspiciously at Gus. It's a most remarkable story, he said, looking very wise and grave indeed. It's really, said Mr. Bunting with a judicial emphasis, a most remarkable story.
Chapter 5. The burglary at the vicarage. The facts of the burglary at the vicarage came to us chiefly through the medium of the vicar and his wife. It occurred in the small hours of Whit Monday, the day devoted in Ipping to the club festivities. Mrs. Bunting, it seems, woke up suddenly in the stillness that comes before the dawn, with a strong impression that the door of their bedroom had been opened and closed. She did not arouse her husband at first, but sat up in bed listening. She then distinctly heard the pad, pad, pad of bare feet coming out of the adjoining dressing room and walking along the passage towards the staircase. As soon as she felt assured of this, she aroused the Reverend Mr. Bunting as quietly as possible. He did not strike a light, but, putting on his spectacles, his dressing gown, and his bath slippers, he went out on the landing to listen. He heard quite distinctly a fumbling going on at his study desk downstairs, and then a violent sneeze. At that he returned to his bedroom, armed himself with the most obvious weapon, the poker, and descended the staircase as noiselessly as possible. Mrs. Bunting came out on the landing. The hour was about 4, and the ultimate darkness of the night was past. There was a faint shimmer of light in the hall, but the study doorway yawned impenetrably black. Everything was still except the faint creaking of the stairs under Mr. Bunting's tread, and the slight movements in the study. Then something snapped, the drawer was opened, and there was a rustle of papers. Then came an imprecation, and a match was struck, and the study flooded with yellow light. Mr. Bunting was now in the hall, and through the crack of the door he could see the desk and the open door and a candle burning on the desk. But the robber he could not see. He stood there in the hall, undecided what to do, and Mrs. Bunting, her face white and intent, crept slowly downstairs after him. One thing kept up Mr. Bunting's courage, the persuasion that this burglar was a resident in the village. They heard the chink of money and realized that the robber had found the housekeeping reserve of gold, £2.10 in half-sovereigns altogether. At that sound, Mr. Bunting was nerved to abrupt action. Gripping the poker firmly, he rushed into the room, closely followed by Mrs. Bunting. "Surrender!" cried Mr. Bunting fiercely, and then stopped amazed. Apparently, the room was perfectly empty. Yet their conviction that they had, that very moment, heard somebody moving in the room had amounted to a certainty. For half a minute, perhaps, they stood gaping. Then Mrs. Bunting went across the room and looked behind the screen, while Mr. Bunting, by a kindred impulse, peered under the desk. Then Mrs. Bunting turned back the window curtains, and Mr. Bunting looked up the chimney and probed it with a poker. Then Mrs. Bunting scrutinized the wastepaper basket, and Mr. Bunting opened the lid of the coal scuttle. Then they came to a stop and stood with eyes interrogating each other. "I could have sworn," said Mr. Bunting. "The candle," said Mr. Bunting. "Who lit the candle?" "The drawer," said Mrs. Bunting, "and the money's gone." She went hastily to the doorway. Of all the extraordinary occurrences, there was a violent sneeze in the passage. They rushed out, and as they did so, the kitchen door slammed. "Bring the candle," said Mr. Bunting, and led the way. They both heard a sound of bolts being hastily shot back. As he opened the kitchen door, he saw through the scullery that the back door was just opening, and the faint light of early dawn displayed the dark masses of the garden beyond. He is certain that nothing went out of the door. It opened, stood open for a moment, and then closed with a slam. As it did so, the candle Mrs. Bunting was carrying from the study flickered and flared. It was a minute or more before they entered the kitchen. The place was empty. They refastened the back door, examined the kitchen, pantry, and scullery thoroughly, and at last went down into the cellar. There was not a soul to be found in the house, search as they would. Daylight found the vicar and his wife, a quaintly costumed little couple, still marveling on their ground floor by the unnecessary light of a guttering candle.
Chapter 6. The Furniture That Went Mad. Now it happened that in the early hours of Whit Monday, before Milly was hunted out for the day, Mr. and Mrs. Hall both rose and went noiselessly down into the cellar. Their business there was of a private nature and had something to do with the specific gravity of their beer. They had hardly entered the cellar when Mrs. Hall found that she had forgotten to bring down a bottle of sarsaparilla from their joint room. As she was the expert and principal operator of this affair, Hall very properly went upstairs for it. On the landing, he was surprised to see that the stranger's door was ajar. He went into his own room and found the bottle as he had been directed. But, returning with the bottle, he noticed that the bolts of the front door had been shot back, that the door was in fact simply on the latch, and with a flash of inspiration he connected this with the stranger's room upstairs and the suggestions of Mr. Teddy Henfrey. He distinctly remembered holding the candle while Mrs. Hall shot these bolts overnight. At the sight he stopped, gaping, with the bottle still in his hand. He went upstairs again. He rapped at the stranger's door, and there was no answer. He rapped again, then pushed the door wide open and entered. It was as he suspected. The bed, the room also, was empty. And what was the stranger, even to his very intelligence? On the bedroom chair and along the rail of the bed were scattered the garments, and only the garments so far as he knew, and the bandages of their guest. His big slouch hat was cocked jauntily over the bedpost. As Hall stood there, he heard his wife's voice coming out from the depths of the cellar, with a rapid telescoping of the syllables and interrogative cocking up of the final words to a high note by which the West Sussex villager is wont to indicate a brisk impatient, "George, you got what I want?" And at that he turned and hurried down to her. "Jenny," he said over the rail of the cellar steps, "'tis the truth what Henfrey says. He's not in his room. He isn't. And the front door's unbolted." At first, Mrs. Hall did not understand, and as soon as she did, she resolved to see the empty room for herself. Hall, holding the bottle, went first. "If he isn't in there," he said, "his clothes are. And what's he doing without his clothes on, then? 'Tis a most curious baseness." As they came up the cellar steps, they both, it was afterwards ascertained, fancied they heard the front door open and shut, but seeing it closed and nothing there, neither said a word to the other about it at the time. Mrs. Hall passed her husband in the passage and ran on first upstairs. Someone sneezed on the staircase. Hall followed 6 steps behind, thought that he heard her sneeze. She, going on first, was under the impression that Hall was sneezing. She flung open the door and stood regarding the room. "Of all the curious," she said. She heard a sniff close behind her, as it seemed, and turning, was surprised to see Hall a dozen feet off on the topmost stair. But in another moment he was beside her. She bent forward and put her hand on the pillow, and then another under the clothes. "Cold," she said. "He's been up an hour or more." As she did so, the most extraordinary thing happened. The bedclothes gathered themselves together, leapt up suddenly into a sort of peak, and then jumped headlong over the bottom rail. It was exactly as if a hand had clutched them in the center and flung them aside. Immediately after, the stranger's hat hopped off the bedpost, described a whirling flight in the air through the better part of the circle, and then dashed straight at Mrs. Hall's face. Then as swiftly came the sponge from the washstand, and then the chair, flinging the stranger's coat and trousers carelessly aside and laughing drearily in voice singularly like the stranger's, turned itself up with its 4 legs at Mrs. Hall, and seemed to take aim at her for a moment, and charged at her. She screamed and turned, and then the chair legs came gently but firmly against her back, and impelled her and Hall out of the room. The door slammed violently and was locked. The chair and bed seemed to be executing a dance of triumph for a moment, and then abruptly everything was still. Mrs. Hall was left almost in a fainting condition in Mr. Hall's arms on the landing. It was with greatest difficulty that Mr. Hall and Milly, who had been roused by her scream of alarm, succeeded in getting downstairs and applying the restoratives customary to these cases. "'Twas the spirits," said Mrs. Hall. "I know it was the spirits. I've read in papers of it. Tables and chairs leaping and dancing." "Take a drop more, Johnny," said Hall. "To steady you." "Lock him out," said Mrs. Hall. "Don't let him in again. I half guessed I might have known with them goggling eyes and bandaged head and never going to church on Sunday, and all they bottles, more'n it's right than any one person to have. He's put on the spirits into the furniture. My good old furniture. 'Twas that very chair my poor dear mother used to sit in when I was a little girl. To think he should rise up against me now. Just a drop more, Jenny, said Hall. Your nerves are still upset. They sent Millie across the street through the golden 5 o'clock sunshine to rouse up Mr. Sandy Wadgers, the blacksmith. Mr. Hall's compliments, and the furniture upstairs was behaving most extraordinary. Would Mr. Wadgers come around? He was a knowing man, and was Mr. Wadgers, and was very resourceful. He took quite a grave view of this case. I'm darned if it ain't witchcraft, was the view of Mr. Sandy Wadgers. You aren't horseshoes for such gentry as he. He came round greatly concerned. They wanted him to lead the way upstairs to the room, but he didn't seem to be in a hurry. He preferred to talk in the passage. Over the way, Huckster's apprentice came out and began taking down the shutters of the tobacco window. He was called over to join the discussion. Mr. Huckster naturally followed over in the course of a few minutes. The Anglo-Saxon genius for parliamentary government asserted himself. There was a great deal of talk and no decisive action. Let's have the facts first, insisted Mr. Sandy Wadgers. Let's be sure we'd be acting perfectly right, busting in there. That there door open. A door on bust is always open to busting, but you can't unbust a door once it's busted in. And suddenly, most wonderfully, the door of the room upstairs opened of its own accord, and as they looked up in amazement, they saw, descending the stairs, the muffled figure of the stranger staring more blackly and blankly than ever with those unresponsibly large blue-glass eyes of his. He came down stiffly and slowly, staring all the time. He walked across the passage, staring, then stopped. Look there, he said. Their eyes followed the direction of his gloved finger and saw a bottle of sarsaparilla hard by the cellar door. Then he entered the parlor and suddenly, swiftly, viciously slammed the door in their faces. Not a word was spoken until the last echoes of the slam had died away. They stared at one another. Well, if that don't lick everything, said Mr. Sandy Wadgers, and left the alternative unsaid. I'd go and ask him about it, said Wadgers to Mr. Hall. I'd demand an explanation. And it took some time to bring the landlady's husband to that pitch. At last he rapped, opened the door, and got as far as, "Excuse me." "Go the devil," said the stranger in a tremendous voice. "Shut the door after you." And so that brief interview was terminated.
Well, that was certainly exciting. Well, I'm Robert Tobias. I had Mike Breen and Will Byrne with me, but weird things happen in the library sometimes. And if you want to suggest something so we can read something about something weird happening, such as, I don't know, another wonderful classic, you can contact us at the Way Team at mccpl.live.al.us, and we'd be glad to read something. We still are accepting submissions for next year. And until then, I guess, keep on reading. And if you want to keep on reading this in particular, there's copies basically everywhere in the system. Enjoy.